So today we're going to talk about ethics in AI and HR. We were already having concerns about analytics, and this seems to be an evolution of that. And I'm really curious about learning more because we also hear a lot about it in the news. Stay tuned for that discussion coming up right now. Hi there, I'm Andrea Adams, and this is the HR Hub. On the show, you get expert insight into anything related to HR. I encourage you to subscribe to the show or podcast to keep learning from my guests. So today, my guest is Megan Marie Butler. Megan is doing her PhD on AI in HR, so she's perfect for this conversation. She and I also already have recorded an episode about just generally an introductory episode to AI in HR. She's also an industry analyst and has been doing that for 6 years. Hi, Megan. How are you?
Thank you for having me again.
Yeah, well, thank you for coming on. That last discussion was fascinating. This one is going to be juicy, I think.
Definitely.
So, let's just I'm going to start big. Are the products being developed for application in HR ethical and legal?
No, that is a good question. Given that we have very little regulation, most are.
Okay.
Within the framework that exists, there are some that are managed to develop outside of that. But I would say most of them would fit in to a sense that it could probably go through a low-level court.
Okay.
And probably make it.
But that's largely, if I understand correctly, because there is no regulation in the field of AI. Chances are we'll have some issues along the way, and then there will be regulations. Okay. So related question, is AI ethical and legal to use it in HR? And I guess what are the ethical issues that we're going to run into?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I say that what we're developing right now is ethical, but I think what we need to touch on first to kind of have this discussion is the concept of social harm. And that's the idea. And as we are in an industry that has very little regulation, there's very little we can do wrong at the moment. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot that we can do wrong in the terms of social harm rather than the legal side. And that's creating new classes of people to discriminate against. That's hiring inappropriately or doing things that may be illegal but are just not transparent at the moment, so nobody knows about it. They're doing it under the table. That on the surface, we feel that we're doing right, but underneath, if we actually look at the practicalities of it, we could see that it's not very ethical or that it's not as useful as we want to believe it is. So when we think about it in terms of social harm, we're in a very big territory of that is how we're finding out what we're doing wrong.
Okay, so I got a couple questions I want to follow up on. The first one is early on in that you said it was creating new classes of people. What do you mean?
Well, we can now, because of AI and the fact that we're using data and patterns to analyze people, we're now able to classify people in more ways. So we can now, in more ways than we traditionally have. And AI is able to start discriminating against people in new ways than we have traditionally. Because as humans, we would discriminate against somebody because they're a female or male, or because of their religion, or they're something visible to us. But to a machine, there's new things for them to discriminate against. And so one product that we were actually doing an analysis on to find out whether it was ethical or not, so not just legal, but ethical, we discovered with how the product was working, that was, what it resulted in was ageism. So it was something we were able to classify, but what it was doing was classifying people with education and skills that were older, and kind of knocking them out of the selection criteria. So if you had an education from 20 plus years ago, you were not relevant enough to the current skills in that area. So it created this new class of people to discriminate against. We were able, as I say, we were able to classify it as ageism because that's how it worked. But So it is able to do some very creative things that we as humans have never even thought of because we don't think in the same way as the algorithms are working.
Okay, that leads perfectly into my next question. It was something else you said in that initial answer, but then you've repeated again. You aren't going to find out some of those things that it's doing until somebody complains 10 years down the road. And meanwhile, it's been doing it for 10 years. Like, how do we find out what it's doing wrong before we've caused a whole ton of social harm?
I think that's a fantastic question. I think that's the hard question we need to be asking industry. I think that's the hard question government needs to be honest about asking themselves. And for me, the answer is very much to follow the same suit as health and safety and high risk work, because we have to recognize that we're in a high risk situation with HR and society right now. And what we need is transparency. And there are some very small regulations in some places where it forces transparency of declaring where it's using AI in the hiring process.
Okay.
So knowing that you may be negotiating against a machine for your salary versus actually negotiating against people. So it's going to negotiate and classify your resume slightly differently. It is a technology that we're all going to start be using, and it will change how we do it in general. But as we go through that process, we need that transparency for individuals to know. And we also need that transparency forced on the industry, both on, and I like personally, to me, it makes sense that there is some sort of ethical review that products need to go through to prove third-party ethical review that they need to prove that their products are compliant and legal and ethical. I have to say it was shocking a few times finding unethical products and seeing product founders or developers kind of go like, oh, okay, well, it doesn't work for that, but like, whatever, we just won't tell anybody, and kind of brushing those concerns away. And I think also too on the business side, and we see this with things like health and safety, where you have to post reports and incidents. And I think the same thing we need to do is to be posting and notifying employees. When are we using your data? How are we using it? And not just having a blanket statement that says at the beginning of employment, we're going to be using your data. We should be always talking about it. And that I'm sure you had that discussion with people analytics ethics, that we're doing all sorts of things with data, and potentially getting things like tracking people. Should we be able to have churn predictors? That's people analytics and AI. Should we have churn predictors that look at the frequency of use on your social media? Is that just that step too far? And what are those steps? And to me, the only way we're going to be able to find that out as a society is if it's transparent and open for us to have a discussion about it, because these things right now are just happening behind closed doors.
Or it's like, don't hire this class of people because they tend to stay less long. Or like,
yeah. There was one that came out. It was years ago. And so what it was it discovered. So it was an application. It was an algorithm that was developed in London, and what they discovered was that people who lived closer to the work location in the city center were more likely to stay longer. And so, well, that makes absolute sense. We'll just hire people who live closer to the office. Well, they inadvertently actually discriminated against all minorities because of basically how people live in the city, and that people who live further out tend to be of a different class of people than people who live closer in the city. So basically, they're just hiring white people who lived in the inner city.
Could afford to live in the inner city. Right.
And it was in this altruistic fashion of, we're going to hire people who stay longer. And this is a variable that corresponds to that. Well, really what was happening in the organization was that white people were just doing better and minorities weren't. So they were quitting more. It had nothing to do with where they live. It had to do with the culture of the organization.
It makes me want to swear, because in HR, you think, oh yeah, like we're just trying to drive down turnover or whatever it is. And we know that this kind of person, turns over less, but inadvertently, using your example, we're violating human rights. How do you check for the inadvertent correlations it's making?
Well, because you need to find causation. We can't be making these people decisions on correlation. That's a huge one. And oh shoot, I'm going to mess up his name. because it's going both directions in my head. Salvador Milo, he is the president or vice president of strategy for HR at Microsoft, and he put it so fantastically. Financial analytics is easy because a dollar is a dollar is a dollar. You can't mess it up. But when you look at people, there's so many variables when it comes to people. When we simplify us down to one or two or three factors and try and do an analysis on it, it's always going to be biased. So there was a really cool product made at the company I'm working for right now, and they're able to detect decay in telephone poles. And one of the data scientists kind of said to me, like, can't we just kind of do the same thing to people? And I'm like, yeah, well, if they all came from the same forest, the same type of tree, the same age, they were cut down at the same time, treated the same way, went through the same conditions, got put into the ground at the same time, and had power lines put in on them at the same time, and they all went through the exact same conditions, sure, no probs. But people don't go through that, even in employment. Like, even our day-to-day lives, even two children in the same family don't have the same experience. And we can't factor that in. We just can never. I had another data scientist that I used to work with years ago. I had a deep down argument with him. It's like, can we make real predictions on people? And he's like, if I have enough data, we can make enough predictions. And I'm just like, at what point in time is it enough data to make accurate predictions on people, and like truly accurate predictions? Because if we could, Amazon would already have the product we were going to buy next at our door. Even with their massive amounts of data, they can't figure that out.
Did we answer the question how to avoid ethical pitfalls?
This is where I really push for a risk management-based approach. So this is the same thing we would use in strategy and high-risk work, where you look at very specific dimensions about what you're doing to evaluate potential risks, and then also weight those risks. How likely is it to happen? How much impact is it going to have? And what type of impact is it going to have? Is it financial? Is it legal? Is it reputational? Will people stop applying for jobs here because we're not using it? Because of what we've done, because people found out something. And so we want to be very aware of those things. And so the encouragement of 7 dimensions that I encourage is, one is like looking around the job. So if you're bringing AI in, who is using the AI and what impact is it having to the job and the work? We already see that in general as a problem in the world of HR today, where a lot of people's job descriptions don't even reflect the work they do. Now we're bringing in this new technology, and their work's changing drastically because of it. So we really need to be conscientious of what's going on there. Another big one, of course, is data privacy, portability, and use. What data are we using? Why are we using it? How are we storing it? Where are we keeping it? All of those really tough questions about the data. And this is where we get into those questions, and HR needs to be involved. A lot of data scientists aren't trained into what that data really represents. And HR is much more of a social science, and that's where we are trained in what does data really represent. It's not just the correlation, but is there actually a relationship there? Is there a causational relationship? And you really need to understand the variables in the data to do that. Another area is the effectiveness and potential misuse of the product. How effective is the product? So great example, there was one product we looked at years ago, and it gave a score. It was like kind of an ABC score on the likelihood that the person would accept a job offer. And it was based on things like how long the person had been at the job, at their previous role, and how long they've stayed at previous roles, and some factors that in our own heads we could probably look at and figure out. But instead of us figuring that out in our own heads by making a judgment call, it was an algorithm giving somebody a score. And if we look at a score, so we have something that claims to be 95% effective, let's say. So if I was to say to you, or even somebody that you would expect to be trained in statistics like this, like, 95% effective, you'd expect your doctor to know, what does that mean? And if you were to ask your doctor that, they would probably say that means 95% of the time it's right. In reality, that couldn't be further from the truth. So when we're looking at a prediction claim, it's looking at how accurate is the prediction within a population. So if we take a population of, say, 10,000 people, and we're going to predict churn. So we're going to predict the prevalence of people likely to churn. And we're going to claim that it's about 2%. So around 200 of the 10,000 people are going to churn. And we have an algorithm that's going to analyze that for that churn. And that algorithm is 95% effective. That means that out of our population, there are 582 positives that will be thrown out. 190 of those will actually be true positives. 392 of them will be false positives. So two-thirds of the predictions are inaccurate. On the flip side, when we're looking at the stairs, it would mean that 1/3 were accurately identified and 2/3 were misidentified. Breast cancer is a fantastic example to compare this to. A lot of us are getting into the age or are at the age of mammogram. And if you've had a parent, a loved one, or yourself have gone through and had a false positive from a mammogram, that's very likely because mammograms throw tons of false positives. If you read the book Prediction Machine, they actually talk about it in there and how to make them more accurate. And the problem is with that false positive is that we need to then go for more biopsy to figure it out. In HR, we don't have that confirmation of false predictions. So we have to rely on these predictions that are coming up quite false. So if you're having somebody say that we have something that's 95% accurate, the problem is that's not effective. And in HR, we're not trained to understand that. So that's a big potential area of risk for people. And then, of course, the area of misuse. So we are using the same example. We have a churn predictor. And our idea is to identify those that are about to leave so that we can help them and stay. And we're going to make sure that maybe give them a spot bonus. We're going to make it better. If we don't put into place really strong barriers in that and processes in that place and say, we're just going to hand it off to managers, because managers should know what to do. They're all great people. Well, one could decide, you get flagged somebody and they find out like, oh, John's thinking of leaving, like, thank God, let's just let him be. Let's cut some more resources. But what if he was one of those false positives? And what if it was he was actually going through some family stress? And so you're using this information now for misuse, where the intention was that we're going to monitor people in this way for this positive thing, but there's this huge potential for misuse. And so that's another area that we really need to be thinking about, or how often you could use something like a selection tool that's going to give us, we're going to select all these people. Well, the recruiters, instead of doing their job and thinking about it critically along with other information, just goes, okay, computer says it, and just hires the first two people that always pop up. So again, another area for misuse. Of course, we always need to be thinking about accountability and liability. Who's accountable? Who is responsible? Are we notifying people? And of course, we always want to be thinking about explainability and transparency, particularly in HR. Though it's not a requirement by law in a lot of areas, it obviously will be. The EU proposed regulation is really putting it forefront that in HR, when we're making these types of decisions, we'll need to be able to explain ourselves. We can never forget bias. Is it fair? Is it unfair? Is it ethical? Are we discriminating against anybody? Is there anybody potentially discriminated against? And have you done your due diligence to ensure that it's not? And then, of course, notification and accommodation. AI creates a potential, because we're using computer, of whole new areas of people that can potentially not access the technology in the same way. I think one of the great example is from Microsoft's accessibility measures. So that idea that if you're able to make it work for a person with one hand, you're like one armed person, that then you're able to make it for a person who's carrying a baby as well. So always thinking about that accessibility. We can talk about this because it was on stage, so nobody can get mad at me for this one. But I was asking a particular product that does not facial recognition, but emotion detection, to understand during conversations, video interviewing, what's going on with the candidate to get more information. And so we had them on stage, and we were doing an interview with them at an event in London quite a few years ago. And, I'd prepped all the questions beforehand. So I thought it was very, we prepped these questions because, of course, it was, what if somebody accessibility issues with it? And so one of the things it made me think of was when I was a teenager, my mom was herself and had Botox, and she had done something and had upset me. And I was really mad at her, and she was trying to be empathetic and say something really nice to me, and was trying to be very kind, but her face wasn't showing it. And I was like, you're saying the right things, but your face is wrong. And so when I thought about this emotion detection, I was like, well, like as women at a certain age, we can, and men tend to go in this. There's also people who do it for medical reasons as well. So I asked the question, if with this emotion detection, can it read through Botox?
Like, oh my God, it feels a little overwhelming. So how do we ask the right questions of the developers of the software we want to buy?
Never think that you have a stupid question. I think that's the most important thing. Ask the most annoying questions. Ask it until you understand. And I think that's another red flag if they're not willing to answer those questions. That may not be the product for you. A good product will keep going down that path and will keep explaining it and keep explaining how their science works in the product. Not just the AI, but a lot of times the social science product, there'll be underlying psychology or other behavioral science underneath it. And they should be able to explain it. They should be able to show you research papers on it. And it should make sense. It shouldn't be something that's like, oh, okay, you're smart. It makes sense to you. It should make sense to anybody.
So we just talked about a whole lot. And you said really at the beginning that there's nothing really out there. Like it's all legal at the moment because there's no laws. Okay. So what can we expect though? There must be stuff coming, and I've heard about some of it, even not watching for it.
Yeah, so we are seeing governments are aware of the potential damage that's causing. And I think what the challenge is that the stronger voice, obviously, in the conversation is coming from industry. So they're pushing for softer regulations than probably what's best in the public interest. We do see regulations coming out places like New York, where they have been fighting for regulations around using artificial intelligence in hiring. We have seen it in a few states quite some time ago. The EU has their proposed regulations that they're pushing through that does put HR and hiring algorithms in the high risk category. But then you also see things like what came out of the UK. And I have to say it was so on the side of innovation that it put society at risk. What they were doing in Canada, they came up with an AI risk assessment, which is great, but it's very technical and isn't helpful to the average person. So we do see things coming. We do see things coming around things like I talked about the risk assessment. In the EU proposed regulations that they talk about doing. In the Canadian regulations, that's what they're talking about as well. So I think the big thing is to be aware and don't be the lawsuit that sets the example. Be a little cautious at times. I think this is one of the places that error on the side of caution is probably a smart thing because I think a great example, we still come back to the H&M fine. A lot of these regulators aren't going to take messing up big lightly.
So I'm going to wrap it up with the question about where we can learn more in managing risk and evaluating risk. Where can we learn more about any of this ethical issues with AI?
That's a great question. The challenge is right now there's not a lot of voices in the space. There are quite a few trying to be in the space, but there's a lot of confusion and a lot of people pushing in a lot of different directions. I think the big thing, I wish I had a website. I say follow me, of course. I will always try and share information as I get it. But the big thing is stay tuned to the conversations, go to the event, listen to what's going on. The conversations are happening, though sparsely at this time. But I think they will start coming more and more forefront as we run into more problems.
Well, thanks, Megan. My brain is exploding from the possibilities of how this could go wrong. Hopefully, we get ahead of at least some of it. Megan and I did an episode on the basics of AI, and a link to that's right here. Thanks for watching out there. We'll see you next time when I talk with another insightful guest.